Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to today's deep dive. If you're joining us right now, I want you to imagine a concept, like a theological framework that has been debated, defended, attacked, and just completely agonized over for more than 150 years. A concept that has literally shaped the identities and the daily habits of millions of people, yet has consistently been the absolute biggest internal storm center for the very community that champions it. Today, you and I are taking a journey into a truly fascinating piece of religious history. We are exploring the anatomy of the Seventh-day Adventist doctrine of the heavenly sanctuary.
It really is a remarkable journey. And before we step into the timeline, I want to set a very clear baseline for you right off the bat. Our mission today is purely historical, psychological, and analytical. We are acting as your impartial guides through a century and a half of theological evolution.
Right, impartial.
Exactly. We are absolutely not here to take sides. We aren't here to endorse this theology, nor are we here to validate the criticisms of those who challenged it. What we're doing is exploring how a massive multi-generational debate actually functions. We're going to look at how religious ideas face intense friction, how they adapt to survive, and how the exact same arguments can be recycled and weaponized by different generations.
Yeah, we're looking at the human beings behind the theology. So to give you the foundation, we have to start in the aftermath of the Millerite movement. Picture it. It's the autumn of 1844. A massive religious revival in the United States, led by a farmer named William Miller, had predicted that Jesus Christ would return to Earth on October 22, 1844.
People sold their farms.
They did. They left their crops in the fields. They completely alienated themselves from mainstream society. And then the sun sets on October 22nd. The sun rises on October 23rd. The world does not end. This becomes known as the Great Disappointment. Imagine the crushing psychological weight of that morning. Only a very small remnant of that movement, people including Hiram Edson and Orell Crozier, refused to let the movement die. They went back to their Bibles and came up with a new theory.
Right. They theorized that the sanctuary mentioned in the biblical book of Daniel, specifically Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, wasn't referring to the earth being cleansed by fire at the second coming. Instead, they argued it was a literal, physical sanctuary in heaven, and that on October 22, 1844, Christ didn't return to earth, but rather moved into a new phase of ministry.
He moved from the holy place into the most holy place.
Exactly, into the most holy place in heaven to begin a final work of judgment and cleansing.
But what's fascinating about the aftermath of 1844 is how quickly this new theory faced its own internal pushback. Even R.L. Crozier, who was one of the primary architects of this heavenly sanctuary theory, very quickly abandoned it. He just walked away from it, along with the seventh-day Sabbath, and left the movement entirely.
Which is wild.
It is. That immediate fracture sets the exact pattern we are going to see over and over again. But of course, there were able defenders who stayed. People like Hiram Edson, Joseph Bates, and James and Ellen G. White. They doubled down. They plumbed the depths of Scripture to build out this framework. In 1906, Ellen G. White famously affirmed that the sanctuary question is the absolute foundation of their faith. It became the most distinctive contribution of Adventism to Christian thought.
But, you know, distinctive contributions always invite distinctive scrutiny. We're going to take a swift, chronological tour through the decades, looking at the major challengers and defenders. And our first major stop is the 1860s, the first real wave of organized dissent.
The 1860s crisis centers in the state of Iowa. And the challengers here are two men, B.F. Snook and William H. Brinkerhoff. Snook was a former Methodist minister who had risen to become the president of the Iowa Conference. Brinkerhoff was a lawyer and served as the conference secretary.
So these were not fringe members.
Not at all. These were high-level, influential leaders sitting right at the top.
And what we see with Snook and Brinkerhoff is the emergence of a highly specific pattern. They didn't just wake up one day and question the sanctuary doctrine in isolation. They questioned a very specific triad of beliefs simultaneously.
The triad.
Yeah, the triad. They opposed church organization, meaning the formal organizing of local conferences and leadership structures. They questioned the prophetic gift of Ellen G. White. And they questioned the sanctuary doctrine.
I want to pause on that triad for a second, because why those three specific things? It's like a three-legged stool. The sanctuary provided the theological reason for their existence after the 1844 disappointment. Ellen G. White provided the spiritual and prophetic guidance to navigate the chaos. And church organization provided the physical, legal structure to actually propagate those ideas and collect funds.
You pull one leg.
The whole thing comes crashing down. You see this pattern repeat endlessly. Those who oppose the sanctuary doctrine almost inevitably develop problems with church organization and the writings of Ellen White.
It is a structural inevitability. The fallout from Snook and Brinkerhoff was significant. By 1865, this internal crisis turned into open rebellion, and they, along with disaffected members in Iowa and Michigan, formed an offshoot group. They called themselves the Marian Party, named after the city of Marion, Iowa. But the historical lineage of this Marian Party is staggering.
This is my favorite part.
They later morphed into the Church of God Adventist. Then, an offshoot of that group formed the Church of God Seventh-day, which still exists today in Denver. And an offshoot of that group formed the Radio Church of God, which eventually became the Worldwide Church of God, led by Herbert W. Armstrong and his son Garner Ted Armstrong.
That is an incredible historical butterfly effect. A theological dispute over the layout of a heavenly sanctuary in small town in Iowa in the 1860s indirectly spawns a massive global media ministry in the 20th century. A ministry which, ironically, eventually repudiated the Saturday Sabbath entirely in more recent times. It really highlights how ideas mutate, travel, and splinter over generations.
Exactly. So those were the challengers of the 1860s. The defenders of this era had to work overtime. James White, the husband of Ellen G. White, was a prolific publisher. Between 1852 and 1870, he wrote a massive series of articles and published several editions of a book called The Sanctuary, The 2300 Days, and The Shut Door. We also see J.N. Andrews step up, who was widely considered the movement's ablest early scholar.
He was a brilliant guy.
He provided a penetrating synthesis of their understanding. But the most colorful example of sheer, unadulterated dedication from this era has to be Uriah Smith.
Oh, the Uriah Smith story is wild. Put yourself in his shoes. He was a 21-year-old convert. He had been in the movement for less than a year, and he was so incredibly fired up, so deeply obsessed with this complex theological concept, that he sat down and wrote a poem. But not just a sonnet. He wrote a 35,000-word poem called The Warning Voice, dealing almost entirely with the sanctuary doctrine.
It is almost impossible to fathom that level of dedication.
Right. That's like writing 150 pages of rhyming couplets about a prophetic timeline. It's like modern-day internet fandoms writing novel-length fan fiction, but applied to 19th century apocalyptic theology. It just shows the intense, burning passion of these early pioneers. They weren't just casually interested in this. It consumed their every waking thought.
Yeah. Uriah Smith would go on to be a prolific author and editor, publishing heavily revised and enlarged books on the sanctuary for decades. The literary output of the pioneers was staggering, thousands of pages dedicated to establishing this single doctrine.
But no amount of publishing could stave off the next wave of doubt. The relative peace didn't last. We move forward 30 or 40 years, right to the turn of the 20th century. And this is a period of massive upheaval. We meet three incredibly prominent figures who renounce the traditional understanding, and their motivations are just as interesting as their theology. Let's start with Dudley Marvin Canwright.
Canwright's story is deeply human. He was ordained at 25, served in major leadership roles, and even sat on the highest executive committee of the denomination. But Canwright had a deeply personal frustration. He longed to be renowned in the broader Protestant world as a popular, respected preacher. He felt heavily restricted and almost embarrassed by having to preach what he called unpopular and peculiar truths. He didn't want to be the weird kid on the theological playground anymore.
That desire for mainstream acceptance is a powerful motivator. He resigns his pastoral position, leaves the church in 1887, becomes a Baptist minister, and writes what is perhaps the most influential external attack on Adventist doctrine ever published, a book titled Seventh-day Adventism Renounced. Canwright's attacks were incredibly sharp and dripping with sarcasm.
He bitterly castigated the sanctuary doctrine, pointing out that the original leaders of the Millerite movement, like William Miller himself, never accepted this heavenly sanctuary teaching. He mocked the evolution of the doctrine, claiming the movement had held 4 different contradictory views on what the sanctuary even was, asking, what will they hold next?
And Canwright brings up a biblical text that is going to become ground zero for the next century of debate. Hebrews chapter 6, verses 19 and 20. Canwright asserted that these verses conclusively prove Christ entered the most holy place and sat upon his throne at his ascension in the 1st century, not in 1844. For Canwright, the idea of a literal 2-apartment sanctuary in heaven with Jesus moving from one room to another was simply an absurdity.
Canwright threw down the gauntlet, but he was mostly attacking from the outside once he left. The next challenger, A.F. Ballinger, took the internal theological challenge to a completely different, highly systematic level. Ballinger's story is crucial. He was a highly successful, deeply beloved missionary and evangelist. He went to Europe in 1901, conducting massive citywide evangelistic campaigns in Great Britain. But while there, studying his Bible, he began to deeply question the timeline of the sanctuary message.
And it wasn't a quiet, overnight transition. Ellen G. White actually sent him impassioned letters across the Atlantic, practically begging him not to pursue his line of thinking.
Yeah.
But he felt convicted. He couldn't stop. In 1905, he presented his dissenting views to the Executive Committee of the British Union and then to a special committee of 25 leaders at the General Conference session in Washington, D.C. He ended up losing his ministerial credentials and published his arguments in a book called Cast Out for the Cross of Christ.
We really need to spend some significant time here because Ballinger's 7 points of departure essentially form the definitive theological template for nearly all the challengers that follow him. If you understand Ballinger, you understand the core mechanics of the sanctuary debate. Let's methodically walk through what he argued.
Okay, let's unpack Ballinger's 7 points. Point number 1 is all about the Greek translation of a single word.
Right. Ballinger argued that Christ started his most holy place ministry in AD 31, immediately at his ascension, not in 1844. His entire linguistic foundation for this was Hebrews 6.1920. The key word in the original Greek is katapetasma, which translates to veil.
Katapetasma.
Yes. Ballinger went back to the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, and claimed that katapetasma always, without exception, refers to the second veil, the specific heavy curtain separating the holy place from the most holy place. Therefore, when the writer of Hebrews says Christ entered within the veil, Ballinger argued it was an absolute linguistic certainty that Christ bypassed the first department and entered the most holy place upon his ascension.
But hold on. If Christ goes straight into the most holy place in AD 31, that leaves a giant logical gap in the timeline. If the earthly sanctuary had a first apartment, the holy place, and a second apartment, the most holy place, and the earthly is a copy of the heavenly, what happened to the first apartment ministry in heaven? That brings us to Ballinger's second point, and honestly, it's one of his most fascinating, almost sci-fi theological theories.
Yes, the theory of angel priests. Ballinger reasoned that if Christ entered the second apartment at his ascension, the first apartment ministry in heaven must have taken place before the cross spanning from the fall of Adam all the way until the death of Christ. But how could Christ minister before her sacrifice? Well, Ballinger argued that the moment Adam sinned, Christ became humanity's substitute. Because Christ vicariously took on human sin, he was legally counted as a sinner and therefore could not approach the pure presence of the Father within the veil until he had actually shed his own blood on the cross to pay the penalty.
Wait, so if Jesus couldn't do it, who was doing the daily ministration in the heavenly sanctuary for all those thousands of years of Old Testament history?
According to Ballinger, it was angels. He argued that angels served as literal priests in the heavenly sanctuary during Old Testament times, with the mysterious figure of Melchizedek serving as the high priest. And he didn't just pull this out of thin air. He heavily utilized specific biblical texts to support this. We have to read them to understand his mindset. He cited Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. Listen to the imagery here. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above it stood the seraphims. Each one had 6 wings. With twain he covered his face, and with twain he covered his feet, and with twain he did fly. And one cried unto another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the post of the door moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. Then said I, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphims unto me, having a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with the tongs from off the altar. And he laid it upon my mouth, and said, Lo, this hath touched thy lips, and thine iniquity is taken away, and thy sin purged.
Wow. So Ballinger looks at that and says, see, an angel is actively purging sin with a coal from a heavenly altar. That is priestly work. He also cited Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14, which asks a rhetorical question about angels. Are they not all ministering spirits sent forth to minister for them who shall be heirs of salvation? And then he went to the book of Revelation, chapter 8, verses 3 and 4, which explicitly describes an angel functioning exactly like a priest at an altar. And another angel came and stood at the altar, having a golden censer. And there was done unto him much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. And the smoke of the incense which came with the prayers of the saints ascended up before God out of the angel's hand.
Exactly. Ballinger used these highly symbolic texts to construct a completely novel, literal, angelic priesthood. Now, later challengers didn't really adopt this specific speculative angel priest theory, but they absolutely kept his basic timeline that the earthly holy place was merely a symbol of the heavenly ministry before the cross, and the earth, the most holy place, symbolized the heavenly ministry after the cross.
Okay, let's look at point 3. Automatic defilement. This is a massive shift in the underlying mechanics of how sin is processed in this theology. The traditional Adventist view is that the heavenly sanctuary is defiled by the confessed sins of repentant people. The blood of the sacrifice acts as a vehicle, transferring the forgiven sin off the sinner and into the sanctuary for storage until the final judgment. But Ballinger said no. He taught that the sanctuary is defiled automatically by the simple commission of any sin anywhere in the universe, whether you confess it or not.
Yes, he argued that even the unconfessed sins of the whole world, and even the original sins of Satan, automatically defiled the heavenly sanctuary the moment they were committed. He pointed to specific verses in Leviticus and Numbers to prove this concept of automatic defilement. Let's read the evidence he presented. Leviticus 20, verses 1 through 3, deals with child sacrifice to false gods. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Again thou shalt say to the children of Israel, Whosoever he be of the children of Israel, or of the strangers that sojourn in Israel, that giveth any of his seed unto Molech, he shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones, and I will set my face against that man, and will cut him off from among his people, because he hath given of his seed unto Molech, to defile my sanctuary, and to profane my holy name.
And then there's Leviticus 21, verse 9, which deals with the priesthood. And the daughter of any priest, if she profanes herself by playing the whore, she profaneth her father. She shall be burnt with fire.
And Numbers 19, verse 20. But the man that shall be unclean, and shall not purify himself, that soul shall be cut off from among the congregation, because he hath defiled the sanctuary of the Lord. The water of separation hath not been sprinkled upon him. He is unclean. He also relied heavily on Leviticus 17, verse 1 and onward, which deals with the improper slaying of animals in the open field instead of at the tabernacle door, imputing blood guilt to the man, saying, Blood shall be imputed unto that man, he hath shed blood, and that man shall be cut off from among his people.
So for Ballinger, these texts definitively prove that sacrificial blood didn't transfer sin into the sanctuary to defile it. The sin defiled it from afar, automatically. Therefore, the blood of the sacrifice was used exclusively to cleanse the sanctuary, never to pollute it.
Which leads perfectly into his fourth point, a finished universal atonement in AD 31. Ballinger looked at Leviticus 16, the famous Day of Atonement chapter, and he saw two distinct, separate atonements occurring. The first was an atonement of iniquity made on the mercy seat for the sins of humanity. He believed Jesus fulfilled this completely, entirely, and finally on the cross, making universal reconciliation for the entire human race and presenting his blood in the most holy place at his ascension.
And we have to understand the historical context here. Early Adventists, following the tradition of William Miller, had a very narrow, specific definition of the word atonement. They applied it almost exclusively to the high priest's final work of intercession or judgment in the sanctuary, not to the actual death of the victim in the courtyard. Ballinger was aggressively pushing back against that narrow definition, demanding that the blood shed on the cross was the finished, complete atonement.
And so, the obvious question rises, what about 1844 then? If absolutely everything regarding human salvation was finished in AD 31, what on earth happened in 1844? That brings us to point 5, Satan's judgment. Remember, Ballinger saw two atonements in Leviticus 16. The second was what he called the atonement of judgment upon the scapegoat, or Azazel.
Ballinger maintained the traditional Adventist view that the scapegoat was Satan, right?
Correct. So his logic was this all-human guilt was canceled at the cross, but the ultimate responsibility for that sin still had to be charged to Satan's account. Therefore, 1844 wasn't about God judging human beings. It was an atonement of judgment specifically convened to condemn Satan as the instigator of all sin.
Point 6 is the unavoidable logical conclusion of point 5. Ballinger completely, unequivocally rejected the concept of an investigative judgment of God's professed people. If the cross canceled the guilt of the whole human race, an ongoing investigative judgment in heaven is totally superfluous. It makes no sense. Instead of a judgment of believers, he reinterpreted the famous first angel's message in Revelation 14, verse 7-2, saying with a loud voice, "Fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come." Traditional Adventism sees that as the start of the 1844 investigative judgment of the saints. Ballinger argued it referred exclusively to God's punitive or destructive judgment upon unrepentant sinners and the papal system, not a quiet investigation of the righteous.
And finally, point 7, which is really the emotional and theological beating heart of all of this. Righteousness by faith. Ballinger's ultimate motivation wasn't just to be academically difficult. He genuinely wanted to safeguard the Christian assurance of salvation. He felt that the doctrine of an investigative judgment, the idea that God is actively poring over the record books of your life to decide if your repentance was good enough, was completely incompatible with righteousness by faith.
He believed you could never have absolute peaceful assurance of the gospel if you were constantly worried about an ongoing investigation of your character in heaven.
This raises a profound question. To what extent did Ballinger have a more balanced, historically Protestant view of the gospel? And to what extent did he fundamentally misunderstand the actual nature and purpose of the Adventist concept of the investigative judgment? Regardless of where you land on that question, his 7 points laid the permanent groundwork for a century of debate. He was disfellowshipped, but he didn't go quietly. He continued publishing a journal called The Gathering Call, and his arguments were so persuasive he actually won over his own father and brother, who were both practicing Adventist ministers.
The psychological toll of these schisms on families must have been immense. Now, Ballinger wasn't the only giant making massive waves at the turn of the century. We absolutely have to talk about Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. And yes, for you listening, this is the Kellogg. The brilliant medical pioneer, the world-renowned surgeon, the autocratic director of the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and the inventor of cornflakes.
That's the one.
He was a polymath who wrote over 50 books. But by the early 1900s, Kellogg's theology took a sharp, highly philosophical turn toward panentheism.
We need to define that clearly. Panentheism is different from pantheism. Pantheism says God is the universe. Panentheism is the belief that God is intimately, literally present within all things, animate and inanimate, while still being greater than them. Kellogg published a controversial book in 1903 called The Living Temple. In it, he wrote, "There is present in the tree a power which creates and maintains it, a tree maker in the tree, a flower maker in the flower." Regarding the human body, he wrote that there is physiological proof of a power that builds and creates, and it is God himself, the divine presence in the temple.
Kellogg was a medical genius, so when he spoke about the mechanics of the body as a divine temple, people listened. But what does this all mean for the sanctuary doctrine? Well, think about the physics of it. If God is literally physically everywhere, acting as the life force in the tree, in the flower, in your digestive tract, then a literal spatial heaven, a literal two-apartment sanctuary up in the sky with angels traveling back and forth, becomes philosophically irrelevant.
We have a record of a fascinating private conversation Kellogg had with a church leader named W.A. Spicer. Kellogg bluntly told him he didn't believe in a particular spatial place called heaven. He said, "Heaven is simply where God is, and God is in the grass, the trees. There's no place for literal angels traveling between heaven and earth." Kellogg literally pointed to his own chest, his own heart, and said, "The sin is here, and here is the sanctuary to be cleansed."
For Kellogg, the sanctuary was entirely internal. Ellen G. White saw this as an absolute existential threat to the movement. She wrote him many letters, warning that his philosophical theories, if carried to their logical conclusion, would destroy faith in the sanctuary question and in the atonement. Despite numerous agonizing attempts at reconciliation by church leaders who desperately wanted to keep their star physician, Kellogg refused to change his views and was disfellowshipped by the Battle Creek Tabernacle in November 1907.
And his later life shows a tragic but logically consistent trajectory. Kellogg eventually came to deny the virgin birth, the divinity of Jesus, humanity's need for a substitutionary atonement, and scoffed at the very idea of a personal, visible God. His philosophical shift completely, systematically dismantled his previous theological framework.
Before we move on to the 1930s, we should mention the defenders of this era, because they had to get much more sophisticated in their arguments. E. E. Andros actually worked with Ballinger in Britain, and he wrote a 250-page book called A More Excellent Ministry in 1912 to specifically counter Ballinger. Andros made a brilliant tactical move. He agreed with Ballinger on one specific linguistic point, that Hebrews 6.1920 does indeed prove Christ entered the most holy place at his ascension.
What's fascinating here is why Andros believed Christ entered it. He didn't concede the whole argument. He argued Christ didn't enter to fulfill the final day of atonement, as Ballinger claimed. Instead, Andros marshaled extensive biblical evidence to argue that Christ entered the most holy place at Ascension to dedicate the entire heavenly sanctuary and inaugurate its services, perfectly mirroring how Moses and the Old Testament priests dedicated the earthly sanctuary before it was used for daily ministry. It's a very nuanced, highly specific counter-argument that preserves the 1844 timeline while respecting the Greek translation of Hebrews.
We also see S.N. Haskell, who wrote The Cross and Its Shadow, a popular, highly typological classic on the sanctuary that's still in print today. And I love the mention of F.C. Gilbert. He was born in London of Jewish parentage, converted to Adventism, and became the secretary for the Jewish department. He brought a unique, deeply cultural perspective to the sanctuary, writing books like Practical Lessons from the Experience of Israel for the Church of Today and Messiah in His Sanctuary. He was trying to reach his kinsmen with this message, bridging the gap between ancient Judaism and 19th century apocalypticism.
Okay, let's jump forward another generation. The mid-century mid-course corrections spanning the 1930s and 1940s. Here's where the geography of the debate expands globally. The internal doubts are no longer confined to the American Midwest or British evangelistic campaigns.
First up is W. Fletcher from Australia. He was an evangelist and a respected Bible teacher at the Australian Mission College. In the late 1920s, he develops new views, shares them with General Conference President W.A. Spicer, and ends up traveling all the way to the U.S. to meet with a committee of 13 top leaders. They meet 7 times. By all accounts, it's a friendly, cordial atmosphere, but they fundamentally, irreparably disagree. The committee concludes his propositions are unbiblical, and Fletcher voluntarily leaves the church.
And what were his propositions? They were essentially a direct echo of Ballinger. Fletcher had 3 main points. First, Christ immediately began his most holy place ministry in AD 31. Second, the sprinkling of blood in the earthly sanctuary symbolizes the expiation, or paying the penalty of sin, not the transfer of sin into the sanctuary. Third, because Ellen White supported the traditional 2-apartment view, her authority as having direct, infallible revelation from God had to be significantly modified.
Fletcher completely dismissed the investigative judgment. He argued that the Hebrew word cleansed in Daniel 8.15 should actually be translated as justified. He believed Daniel 8.17 wasn't about an investigative judgment happening up in heaven, but about the restoration of the truth of Christ's mediatorial ministry down on earth, a truth which had been distorted for centuries by papal systems. He eventually crystallized his views in a book in 1932 called The Reason for My Faith.
Meanwhile, over in Europe, an absolute titan of administration was harboring his own profound doubts. L.R. Conradi. He was the immensely powerful president of the European Division for decades. He was a brilliant historian and linguist. In fact, he is credited with popularizing the idea that the daily mentioned in Daniel 8.14-13 refers to the ongoing mediatorial work of Christ, an interpretation the Church largely holds today.
But Conradi had a massive theological divergence when it came to the math of Daniel 8. He believed the 2300 days had absolutely nothing to do with cleansing a heavenly sanctuary. He bizarrely claimed it pertained to the history of Islam. He argued that the year 1844 was significant only because that was the year the Islamic Turks were compelled by European powers to exercise tolerance toward Christians.
It's such a sharp, almost incomprehensible left turn from the rest of his theology. He also concluded the investigative judgment was totally unbiblical, but here is the psychological kicker. He had held these dissenting views quietly for decades. Imagine the mental toll, the cognitive dissonance of serving as the top official for an entire continent, preaching and administrating a system you fundamentally believe is flawed at its core.
That sounds exhausting.
But finally, in May 1931, he couldn't keep it in anymore. He published an editorial in a German paper, Herald of Truth, making his views public. This led to a massive hearing in Omaha, Nebraska, with 27 church leaders. Conradi initially agreed to a compromise. He would resign from his administrative offices but keep his ministerial credentials if he promised to stay quiet about his divergent views. But by 1932, the internal pressure was too much. He started preaching his views publicly again, lost his credentials, and at the age of 76, after more than half a century as a pillar of the Adventist Church, he walked away to become a Seventh-day Baptist.
At 76, starting over. And just like Smick and Brinckerhoff and just like Fletcher, Conradi also had major issues with Ellen G. White. At his hearing, he specifically said he accepted her counsel on how to live a healthy Christian life, but, quote, when it comes to matters of doctrine, then this is another matter altogether. That interconnected triad of doubt, organization, profit, sanctuary strikes again.
To counter these mid-century challenges, the church relied heavily on M.L. Andreessen. He was the leading, undisputed authority on the sanctuary during this era, teaching at the Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. from 1938 to 1949. Interestingly, he actually listened to Ballinger's 1905 trial through an open window when he was a young, impressionable minister. He wrote a definitive, highly influential book called The Sanctuary Service.
But Andreessen wasn't just defending the old pioneer views. He introduced an extremely provocative, controversial perspective of his own that would shape the psychology of the church for decades. He argued that the underlying ultimate purpose of the investigative judgment wasn't just to sort out who was saved, but for the cosmic vindication of God.
We need to do a deep analysis of Andreessen's theology because it sets the stage for a massive amount of modern religious anxiety. Andreessen argued that this cosmic vindication of God's character required the absolute flawless, sinless perfection of an end-time remnant of believers. He saw three essential phases of the atonement. Phase 1, Christ's sinless life on earth. Phase 2, Christ paying the penalty on the cross. Phase 3, Christ's post-cross ministry in heaven, which culminates in a final generation of living saints who demonstrate to the universe that Christ's victory over sin is completely humanly repeatable.
He actually claimed that Christ literally cannot return until this final demonstration of sinless perfection takes place. The universe is waiting on humans. He believed the cleansing of the sanctuary didn't just mean wiping away records in heaven. It meant literally eliminating and destroying the very presence of sin within the living saints on earth. And like traditional Adventists, he believed the scapegoat was Satan, who bears the final blame as the instigator of sin.
While people initially liked the philosophical idea of vindicating God against Satan's accusations, Andreessen's insistence on absolute sinless perfection caused massive internal friction. Think about the psychological burden of that theology. If you are told that Jesus cannot return until you achieve absolute flawless perfection, imagine the anxiety that breeds. Every mistake isn't just a personal moral failure, it's delaying the cosmic timeline. Furthermore, underlying his entire theology was the absolute non-negotiable necessity that Christ had a sinful human nature. Andreessen believed that if Christ overcame sin with a sinful nature, then humans with sinful natures could do the exact same thing to prove God right.
This theology led to a bitterly tragic end for Andreessen. Late in life, from 1955 to 1962, he viciously attacked church leaders over the publication of a landmark book called Questions on Doctrine. That book, written to explain Adventism to evangelical scholars, affirmed that Christ had a sinless human nature and that the sacrificial atonement was essentially finished at the cross. Andreessen believed those two positions completely destroyed the very essence of the sanctuary message he had dedicated his life to defending. He felt betrayed by his own church.
It is a profound example of how highly specific theological definitions, like the exact genetic nature of Christ's humanity, are never just academic debates in a vacuum. For Andreessen, it was the load-bearing linchpin of the entire cosmic conflict. If you change the nature of Christ, you destroy the ability of the final generation to vindicate God.
Which brings us to the modern era shockwaves, the 1970s through to the present. If you thought the previous decades were turbulent, the modern era is an absolute earthquake. We start with an Australian named Robert Brinsmead, or Bob Brinsmead. He studied theology at Avondale College in the late 1950s. He's described as having an amazing, almost charismatic capacity to make sudden, radical shifts in his theology and somehow logically carry tens of thousands of followers with him every time he pivoted.
We can track his extraordinary theological roller coaster through 4 distinct phases over 40 years. Phase 1 is the perfectionist phase in the 1960s. Building heavily on Andreessen's ideas, Brinsmead taught a highly psychological, internalized version of the sanctuary. He literally mapped the physical layout of the Old Testament sanctuary onto human anatomy and psychology. The outer courtyard represented the physical body, the holy place was the conscious mind, and the most holy place was the deep human subconscious.
So for Brinsmead, the cleansing of the sanctuary wasn't happening in a building in heaven. It meant the miraculous removal of original sin from the human subconscious. He taught that God would instantaneously remove the sinful nature from his people so they could stand without a mediator during the apocalyptic end times. This radical teaching got him disfellowshipped in 1962, but he gained an enormous global following of people seeking this psychological cleansing.
But then comes phase 2 in the 1970s, the evangelical phase. Brinsmead does a complete 180-degree turn. He is convinced by another Australian scholar, Desmond Ford, to completely abandon perfectionism and embrace the classic Protestant doctrine of justification by faith alone. He edits a widely read journal called Present Truth and starts heavily critiquing the traditional sanctuary message because he feels it fundamentally contradicts this new, liberating understanding of the gospel of grace. He publishes a definitive book in 1979 called 1844 Re-Examined.
Then phase 3 in the 1980s is the liberal phase. He rejects the Sabbath, accepts historical critical methods of reading the Bible, and abandons Orthodox Christian teachings entirely. And finally, phase 4 in the 1990s and beyond, the universalist phase. He completely abandons apocalyptic theology. He gets into politics, environmentalism, and I'm not making this up, running a massive theme park called Tropical Fruit World in Australia. He promotes a vague religion of environmentalism and human compassion with zero interest in biblical doctrine. What an incredibly wild ride from cosmic perfectionism to a tropical food park.
It truly is. But you mentioned Desmond Ford, the man who catalyzed Brinsmead's shift to the evangelical phase. Ford is universally recognized as the most consequential, polarizing figure in the modern era of this debate. He was a brilliant, highly charismatic scholar, earning a PhD in New Testament under the eminent Protestant scholar F. F. Bruce. Ford was the chairperson of the religion department at Avondale College in Australia for 16 years. He trained an entire generation of ministers.
Yeah. Let's set the scene for the climax of Ford's story. It's October 1979. Ford is on a teaching exchange at Pacific Union College in California. He gives a presentation to a chapter of the Association of Adventist Forums, a group of progressive academics. In this presentation, he explicitly publicly calls into question the biblical basis for the investigative judgment. He outlines his views on the book of Hebrews, stating definitively that Christ's anti-typical Day of Atonement ministry began at the cross, not in 1844.
The church leadership realizes they have a massive crisis on their hands. They respond by bringing him to church headquarters in Washington, D.C., relieving him of teaching duties and giving him 6 months of paid leave to write down his views fully. Ford produces a massive, incredibly dense 991-page manuscript titled Daniel 8.14, The Day of Atonement and the Investigative Judgment. To deal with this unprecedented scholarly challenge, in August 1980, the church convenes a massive gathering of 114 top theologians and administrators at a place called Glacier View Ranch in Colorado.
This is the famous Glacier View meeting. It's essentially a modern-day theological trial. We need to walk through the 10 major areas of disagreement between Ford and the Sanctuary Review Committee at Glacier View, because this is the theological culmination of everything that came before. It's like all the previous challengers' arguments were refined and perfected by Ford.
First, the committee felt Ford quoted traditional Adventist authors out of context to support his new views. Second, and this is the core issue we saw back with Ballinger, Ford insisted Christ entered the heavenly most holy place at his ascension to begin the anti-typical Day of Atonement, completely denying a judgment phase beginning in 1844. Third, his specific reading of the phrase within the veil in Hebrews 6 precluded any two-phase ministry in heaven. If Christ went straight to the throne, there is no room for a holy place ministry.
Fourth, Ford essentially rejected the traditional historicist view of prophecy and the year-day principle. The idea that a prophetic day in apocalyptic literature equals a literal year in history. Without that mathematical principle, you cannot get from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem in 457 BC to the year 1844. The math simply evaporates. Fifth, there was a major disagreement over Ford's heavy use of what scholars call the apotelismatic principle.
Let's define the apotelismatic principle clearly. Think of it like a fractal. It is the idea that apocalyptic prophecies aren't just fulfilled once in a single linear historical event. Instead, they can have multiple repeated fulfillments throughout history, each one echoing the pattern until the final consummation. The committee strongly disagreed with how heavily Ford relied on this to explain away specific dates. This leads directly to the sixth point. Ford rejected the traditional Adventist translation of the Hebrew word nitzdak in Daniel 8.14. Adventists traditionally translated it as cleansed. Ford argued that linguistically it meant something else, like justified, vindicated, or restored to its rightful state.
Seventh, Ford logically linked Daniel 9 with Daniel 7 and 8 in a way the committee rejected, blurring the distinct timelines. Eighth, and this is absolutely crucial, Ford argued that the little horn of Daniel 8, the evil entity that attacks the sanctuary, was precisely historically fulfilled by the ancient Syrian king Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century BC. He claimed all other fulfillments, like papal Rome, were just secondary apotelismatic reinterpretations. The historicist view rigidly insists the little horn represents the system of Rome.
Ninth, Ford insisted that in the judgment scene of Daniel 7, only the little horn is judged and condemned, not the saints. The saints are merely vindicated. Just like Ballinger, Ford deeply believed that an investigative judgment of God's people was fundamentally morally opposed to salvation by grace alone. And 10th, returning to our classic triad of doubt, Ford viewed Ellen G. White's authority as strictly pastoral and devotional. He explicitly denied she had any hermeneutical authority to establish or define doctrinal issues from Scripture.
The aftermath of Glacier View was an absolute earthquake. Ford's employment was terminated, he lost his ministerial credentials, and he formed an independent evangelical ministry called Good News Unlimited. But the shockwaves caused a mass exodus. Hundreds of ministers and thousands of members who agreed with Ford's evangelical emphasis left the church. People like Dale Rapslaff, who started his own ministry specifically dedicated to opposing Adventist doctrines. It was a trauma the denomination is still processing.
And how did the church defend its position against a PhD scholar like Ford, with an unprecedented scholarly output of their own? Following Glacier Review, the General Conference appointed the Daniel and Revelation Committee. Over the next decade, this committee published a massive, highly technical 7-volume series providing in-depth exegesis of Daniel, Revelation, Hebrews, and the sanctuary message to counter Ford's arguments point by painstaking point. They fought scholarship with scholarship.
So we've just survived a whirlwind, 150-year tour of intense, deeply personal theological combat. But what does this all mean for you listening right now? To synthesize this incredibly dense history, we are going to extract exactly 10 takeaways about the core disputes and 10 applications regarding why this matters today, drawing directly from the concluding synthesis of our sources.
Let's start with the 10 takeaways. These are the 10 basic disputed battlegrounds that have surfaced over and over again, from Canright to Ford. Number 1, the tension between the investigative judgment and the assurance of salvation. Is a judgment of believers just a face-saving psychological device invented to explain away the 1844 disappointment, or is it a profoundly biblical reality? And more importantly, does it inherently destroy Christian assurance? Number 2, the literal reality of the heavenly sanctuary. Is it a real structure existing in space and time, or is it purely a metaphor for the plan of salvation? Is there an actual physical continuity between the earthly copy built by Moses and a heavenly original?
Number 3, the mechanics of defilement and cleansing. Does the commission of sin automatically defile a sanctuary across the universe, or do confessed sins defile it through the transfer of blood? Does sacrificial blood cleanse, or does it defile? Number 4, the identity of the scapegoat, Azazel, in Leviticus 16. Is the scapegoat a symbol of Christ bearing our sins into the wilderness of death, or is it Satan taking the final punitive blame for instigating the rebellion?
Number 5, the validity of the historicist method. Can we trust the historicist interpretation and the mathematical year-day principle to pinpoint dates in the 19th century, or should we adopt preterist methods that say prophecies were fulfilled in the past, or futurist methods that say they are all yet to happen? Number 6, the identity of the little horn in Daniel 8. Is it a past Syrian king like Antiochus Epiphanes, or does it point to the vast historical system of Rome, and is it legitimate to use the apodictismatic principle for multiple layered fulfillments?
Number 7, the deeply complex interpretation of Daniel 8.14. Are we dealing with 2,300 full literal days or 1,150 days, 2,300 evening mornings? Do they actually start with the decree in 457 BC? What does the Hebrew word nitzdak truly mean? And was the Karaite calendar date of October 22 even accurate? We should clarify that the Karaites were a sect of Judaism that calculated the new moons differently than Rabbinic Jews, which pushed the Day of Atonement in 1844 to late October instead of September. The pioneers staked their entire timeline on that specific calendar. Number 8, the meaning of entering within the veil in the book of Hebrews. Did Christ definitively start the anti-typical Day of Atonement in AD 31, or does the linguistic structure of Hebrews allow for a 2-apartment heavenly ministry spanning 20 centuries?
Number 9, the sanctuary doctrine in the book of Revelation. Does Revelation point to a future investigative judgment of God's own people, or just a final punitive judgment upon the corrupt system of Babylon? What does the hour of his judgment in Revelation 14.7 actually refer to? And finally, number 10, the authority of Ellen G. White. Are her writings authoritative, infallible clarifications of Scripture on doctrinal matters, or is her inspiration strictly limited to pastoral devotional encouragement? Those are the 10 historical battlegrounds.
Now let's translate those theological battles into 10 practical applications for you, based on the external challengers and cultural relevance. Why does any of this academic history matter to how you view the world today? Application 1. Your view of reality matters. The sources note that traditional Protestant and Catholic theology is largely based on Platonic dualism, the philosophical idea that the physical world is bad and the spiritual realm is an immaterial, timeless void. This makes a physical, spatial heaven with a literal sanctuary philosophically impossible. If your philosophical baseline says heaven is just a timeless state of mind, your theology will automatically reject this doctrine. Philosophy dictates theology.
That is a profound point. Application 2, the trap of predestination. External critics from Calvinist traditions, like Walter Martin or Donald Barnhouse, reject the investigative judgment outright. Why? Because Calvinism generally believes in double predestination, that God already determined exactly who is saved and who is damned from eternity past. If God already predestined the outcome before you were born, an investigative judgment is completely illogical. How you view human free will changes absolutely everything about how you view God's judgment.
Application 3. Theodicy is personal. The Odyssey is the attempt to vindicate God's goodness in a world overflowing with evil. The sanctuary doctrine, with its investigative judgment, the open record books, and the scapegoat taking the final blame, is ultimately an attempt to transparently vindicate God's character before the entire watching universe. It answers the deepest human question: is God actually fair?
Application 4. Corporate versus individual cleansing. The sources mention Jewish scholars like Jacob Milgram, who argue for a one-stage atonement. In their view, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, was just a massive annual purge of the physical temple, not a final judgment of individual souls. The Adventist model argues for two stages: individual forgiveness granted continuously during the year, and a massive corporate cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary at the end of time. It asks you to deeply consider how you process your own personal forgiveness versus the ultimate cosmic restoration of the whole universe. They are two different phases of healing.
Application 5. The pressure of postmodernism. In a modern era that constantly asks, so what? Abstract theological concepts have to prove their practical relevance. If we are truly living in an anti-typical Day of Atonement, a time of cosmic judgment, how does that actually change the way you treat your neighbor today? If it doesn't change your daily ethics, postmodernism dismisses it as irrelevant trivia.
Application 6. The danger of echo chambers. Look at the history of these challengers. From Ballinger to Conradi to Brinsmead. Many of them isolated themselves, harbored their secret doubts for decades, and eventually spun into theological extremes. It shows how absolutely vital, transparent, open community dialogue is for maintaining intellectual and spiritual balance. Secrecy breeds extremism.
Application 7. The quest for absolute perfection. M.L. Andreessen's final generation theology forces us to deeply examine our relationship with perfectionism.
Really?
Does God demand flawless, robotic behavior to validate his grace? And if so, what does that demand do to the human psyche? We've seen how that pressure can lead to bitter, judgmental infighting.
Application 8. The psychology of faith. Bob Brinsmead mapping the physical courtyard, holy place, and most holy place onto the human body, mind, and subconscious is fascinating. It shows our desperate, innate human need to internalize vast cosmic ideas. We are always trying to map the divine onto our own skin. We want the cosmic conflict to make sense of our internal psychological struggles.
Application 9. The timeline of grace. The intense debate over whether everything was finished in AD 31 versus 1844 is fundamentally a debate about the timeline of divine intervention. Does grace have a ticking clock? When does infinite mercy transition into final absolute justice?
And application 10, living in the anti-typical day. If the basic premises of this doctrine are true, what does it genuinely mean for you to live with the acute, daily awareness of an ongoing, real-time cosmic judgment happening right now? How does that monumental awareness relate to your ethics, your social justice, and your daily choices?
That is an immense amount of historical, psychological, and theological ground we've covered today. From 1844 to tropical fruit parks, we've seen it all.
We have. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something inspired by the subtext of all this history. Notice how almost every single challenger, from Ballinger to Brinsmead to Ford, ultimately struck at the sanctuary doctrine because they felt it undermined their personal feeling of salvation. They desperately wanted absolute assurance. It reveals a profound, almost tragic human tension. How do we reconcile a deep, aching desire for absolute, unshakable grace with the logical belief in a God who must eventually demand accountability and final justice to fix a broken universe? Is it possible that the 150-year storm center of the sanctuary doctrine isn't just a debate about Bible verses, but is actually a reflection of the eternal war inside the human heart? The endless war between wanting to be loved unconditionally and needing the universe to be perfectly just.
That is a phenomenal question to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. As always, keep questioning your assumptions, keep reading, and keep exploring your sources. We'll see you next time.